Right, it's my very great pleasure to be giving this talk to the New Mexico Tech. A previous version of it got interrupted by hackers. Hopefully this one won't. The brief of the talk is to look at the role that science plays in our governing ourselves and responsibility towards each other. And I think this talk hopefully will fit into that. It begins here in 1649, where science essentially begins when Charles I gets his head chopped off. He's not having his head chopped off by usurpers to his throne. He's not being killed by invaders. It's his own people who want a new way to govern themselves that are doing this. 10 years later, the monarchy is restored, but it's no longer an absolute monarchy, as Charles was. It's a constitutional monarchy. One of the first things Charles II, his son, does is to create the Royal Society, which is where we usually think science begins these days, because of the ground rules the Royal Society had, which was they weren't going to discuss theological questions or philosophical questions. They were only going to discuss issues that could be resolved with data. Whether you were Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Jew or atheist, you had to leave your beliefs at the door and just look at what was happening to you in the experimental apparatus in front of you and work out what the best explanation for this is. You could leave the room to do one thing, which was to run a further experiment to generate more data, which might, of course, help change views. But essentially, the group had to come to a consensus as to the best explanation for what's happening. But that was often a case of, that often generated further questions rather than solving things for all time. Now, that's where we usually say science began. But 40 years later, there was this, when Walter Raleigh was executed for apparently being guilty of conspiring too closely with the Europeans for the English. But the problem was he was convicted on the basis of what we now call hearsay. That is, people who were saying things that he'd said and did, but outside the court, who didn't come into court to be examined and cross-examined. And after his death, the English legal system and legal systems throughout the Western world recognized the injustice of this and the fact that we need to make sure that when a juror, 12 people who might be a mix of Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and atheists, left the beliefs at the door and just looked at what the evidence in front of them said, the evidence that was generated by examination and cross-examination. So you get out of this, you get on the balance of probabilities, the likeliest cause for what's happened, but you also remain open to the fact that if further evidence turns up that you may change your mind. The view you have is a provisional view, but this is true of all of science as well as legal systems. So let me leave it there for the moment and take you to when I entered neuroscience around 1980. And the field was still influenced then by people like Walter Hess, who trained the generation of people who trained me. And Hess, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in 1949, said that, do you think studying monolayers of cells is going to tell you anything? Or the rate at which ions move across membranes, or which ions are moving? He said, no, the key thing is to look at what the organism's trying to do. It's the question of function. And for me, the question of function moving into neuroscience at the time was trying to understand women and get them to fall in love with me. Now, by luck, I happened to be working on serotonin reuptake in people who were depressed before we got the SSRI group of drugs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And it was based on this paper by Yauku Tumishtu, who had reported that people who are depressed have lowered serotonin reuptake. What I found, trying to repeat this, was that methods are everything, and they often generate further questions rather than give answers. We also found that serotonin reuptake was lowered in people who were depressed at one point during the day, but not at others when it was normal or apparently high. So the picture became more complex. We got more questions rather than answers. And the other thing was this: Later, I was a doctor who, having worked in the serotonin system, the pharmaceutical companies thought would be a great person to help explain the new SSRIs to the average doctor. And it became very clear to me that the serotonin the pharmaceutical industry were interested in was nothing like the neuroscience serotonin. It was biobabble. It was marketing copy. It was something other than real science. My background working in the lab and working clinically with people and educating doctors for the pharmaceutical companies meant that everybody thought I was one of them, and the lab scientists and the clinicians who helped discover the illnesses the drugs treated and the pharmaceutical company people who devised the marketing campaigns were all happy to talk to me. And I did a series of over 100 interviews with people like Arvid Carlson here, whom you see, who got a Nobel Prize for his work on dopamine, and then was the first person to make an SSRI, a drug called Zimelidine. So I was very much one of them. That's why they felt comfortable with me, and I still am. But into my life, we had this happen. This is a Dutch cartoon book, and the Dutch says nothing is out of hand, which means everything is in control. But if you see the cartoon, you see actually things aren't in control. And shortly after Prozac came on the market in the UK, I had a chance to see one man I gave Prozac to become suicidal and one other man that someone else gave Prozac to become suicidal. And the problem cleared up once you took the drug away, and it reappeared once you put them on another SSRI. And I had access to their full medical history and their labs, and I could get my colleagues to interview them, and I could think about the cases and go back and interview them myself and see the changes over time. I could get in touch with the pharmaceutical company, Lilly, who made Prozac, and say, did they have any other cases like this? And it turned out, actually, they didn't tell me they did, but it turned out they had. They had a bunch of other cases which had appeared in the academic literature, doctors reporting exactly the same thing that I'd found, patients going on Prozac, becoming suicidal. The problem cleared up when you reduced the drug and reappeared when you put them back on the drug. So it seemed terribly clear that the drug was causing some people to become suicidal. Now, at just the same time as this article came out, an article from Lilly, where the first author was Charles Beasley, was published in the British Medical Journal, and here it is. And Lilly made the argument that there have been these cases which look awfully sad, and it looks like the drug might have caused the problem, but we have analyzed all of our clinical trials, and actually the clinical trials show no evidence that the drug has caused the problem. And they said there's three things you need to remember. The plural of anecdote is not data, but in fact, if this were true, Google wouldn't work. This paper came out in 1991, before we had Google. We wouldn't have had Google if what they're saying is true. They also said it's the disease, not the drug, that's causing the problem. And finally, they said, are you going to believe the science, the controlled trials, or are you going to believe the anecdotes? These days, they'd have said, are you going to believe the misinformation? So on the one hand, we've got a good and thorough clinical interview by me and other doctors, which point towards the fact that the drug can cause the problem for some people. And we tend to look at that as, we tend to look at good interviewing as a good bedside manner. It's part of the art of medicine. It's nice if it's there, but it's really not the real thing. It's not the science of medicine, which is in the controlled trials, which is what this advert from Janssen picks out. Most of us these days, and most doctors and patients they don't particularly care if you've got a good bedside manner. They want you to have treatments that work. And controlled trials apparently offer just that. Controlled trials are confounder-free. On the opposite side, the art of medicine, the good interviews, the humanities say, well, they're context-rich, and this makes up for the fact that, in controlled trials, you've got a confounder-free situation. The controlled trials are seen as the hard end of medicine, and good interviewing as, well, maybe the soft side of medicine, if it's any part of medicine at all. But if we're going to run a randomized controlled trial on antidepressants, you've got to have rating scales. And this is Max Hamilton, who created the first depression rating scale. And here he is saying that, it's good and bad side. You're going to standardize interviews, which can be a good thing. and a bad thing. Now, it might be difficult for you to think that standardizing an interview is a bad thing, but the next slide brings out a problem, which is we've got a doctor here on the right interviewing a man on the left in a very standardized way and not hearing him or seeing him. She's using a depression rating scale, which is items for, are you suicidal? And if he says he is, she's going to rate him up. Are you anxious, more anxious than before? Yes, I am. She's going to rate him up. Are you able to make love? No, I'm not. She's going to rate him up. But all of these things can be caused by the pill as frequently as they can be caused by the illness. So if he gives her answers without her making a judgment call and she just rates them up, there's a default to the illness, there's a higher score, and the higher the score, the more the call for a pill. But of course, if the pill is causing the problem and she doubles the dose of the pill or adds a further pill in, she's potentially going to kill him. Judgment calls are, and deviating from the standard is terribly important in the practice of medicine. If you're going to help this man live the life that he wants to live, you need judgment. Otherwise, you're going to help him live the life that Lilly and Pfizer want him to live. Now, up to the SSRIs, up to about that point in time, we brought our problems to doctors. As of the 1980s, 1990s, medicine began to give us problems we didn't know we had, and the depression rating scale score holds a clue to that. And you see it here. The pharmaceutical companies sell the most pills and make by far the most money, not from treating diseases anymore, but from treating risk factors. If you've got reduced peak flow rates, if you've got raised lipid levels, raised blood glucose, raised blood pressure, or whatever, decreased bone density, these are all risk factors, and the pills look like a seductive answer. An industry in the business these days of creating apps for our mobile phones that are going to monitor our mood states and our emotions and, in due course, our brain waves. And for all of these things, a pill will be an answer because we're worth it, supposedly. The weighing scales is here to bring the point home, which was people began to weigh themselves on scales like this around the 1860s. 10 years later in France, a new illness was described, anorexia nervosa. 40 years later, in the roaring 20s, eating disorders mushroomed because partly weighing scales had migrated to drugstores and pharmacies and came with metal plates on them showing our ideal weight for our height and sex. And they mushroomed again in the 1960s when all of us began to get bathroom weighing scales. This is a problem and illness only in the Western world, or only in places where there were weighing scales. It's now a problem worldwide as weighing scales have migrated elsewhere. The point I'm trying to make is that industry recognized that the measurement is an illness. When you produce figures, you produce the kind of situation where their drugs or whatever can become an answer. We now have COVID dashboards, and that's the one from Ontario here, which people monitor a lot, and it tends to generate the behaviors that we've got on a wider scale, not just as individuals. Facebook, the Facebook likes and dislikes shape hugely the behavior of individuals. People often rate lectures like this one, and if I was going to pay any heed to the ratings you give me, I'd probably tailor the lecture that I was giving to make sure you gave me a good score. In the week that Meatloaf died and his famous song Paradise by the Dashboard Light, it occurred to me that what we've got here is paradise by the dashboard light for the pharmaceutical industry, but hell by the dashboard light for the rest of us. So to run a randomized control trial, you need measurements like this, which a drug is going to make a difference to. Now, here's Tony Hill, who ran the first randomized control trial, the first RCT. And he's here saying that they're not a good way to evaluate a drug. I'm going to be giving you all of these slides and the text that goes with them, and you can you'll be able to read what he's saying here and work out what it's meaning. But the point he's trying to say is that a drug can do 100 things. in a randomized control trial, we just look at one thing that the drug is doing, which may not be the most common thing that it's doing, and it can be helpful from that point of view, partly because of the intense focus on just one thing. If we're trying to play golf, though, and just have one randomized control trial golf club in the bag, we're not going to play a good round of golf. You need a full range of clubs to be able to play a good round of golf. So let me show you this video here, which brings the point home. Right, that's exactly what happens in all RCTs. And let me bring the point home to you by talking about the depression RCTs. The mood change that industry is interested in is relatively uncommon and relatively small and only appears after a few weeks and needs an intense focus to spot it. And because of the intense focus, people miss something that happens within 30 minutes of the first pill, at least the first SSRI pill that you take, which is that genitals become numb. Now, this means that you don't make love the way you would normally. The problem will often clear up once you halt the drug. That's if you halt the drug. But for a number of people, even when you halt the drug, it may endure for months or years or forever afterwards. This is something that's worth a lot more to people than the slight mood change that there may be that the pills can also produce. But it gets missed in controlled trials, which don't evaluate the full effects of these drugs very well. Let me bring the point out as well by showing you this. Imipramine was the first of the antidepressants. It's a more potent antidepressant than the SSRIs that came after it. It treats melancholia, which they can't. And melancholia, or severe depression, is an illness that leads a lot of people to commit suicide. A year after Imipramine launched, there was a conference in Europe where doctors got together and talked about this wonderful new drug that was going to transform things for a lot of patients. But they noted that a small proportion of patients given this drug become agitated and suicidal. Stop the drug and the problem clears up. Reintroduce the drug and the problem comes back. So Imipramine can cause some people to become suicidal. But nevertheless, this drug that can cause suicide, put into a controlled trial like this, we would expect to save lives so that there are more suicidal events in the placebo arm than in the active treatment arm. In contrast, when the SSRIs were put into controlled trials to bring them on the market, these were drugs that only work for people who are mildly to moderately depressed. And because of this, these are at low risk of going out to commit suicide. The data from the controlled trials showed that these drugs appeared to cause people to become suicidal, and FDA put a black box warning on them. If you put imipramine into the same group of patients, you will get the same outcome. So we've got two sets of controlled trials for this drug, which are producing diametrically opposite answers. And this is a hazard. Every time a treatment or an illness produce superficially similar outcomes, like people becoming suicidal on either depression or its treatment, you can get these kind of problems. And this applies to a lot of drugs right across medicine. It's not just a depression thing. Part of the problem here is you're thinking of imipramine in treating people who are depressed, or Prozac in treating people who are depressed, as drug trials. They're not. Drug trials are when you give these drugs to healthy volunteers and see what happens. And when industry did this but didn't publish the results, you could see that healthy volunteers became suicidal and committed suicide, could become homicidal, could have their love life wiped out forever and could become dependent on these drugs and find it very difficult to get off. When you run treatment trials, you introduce confounders into the picture that no amount of randomization can ever get rid of. Let me just give you one more detail with these red balls, which is when you're running antidepressant trials, there's a 2-week period where you take people off prior treatment before you begin them in the randomized phase of the trial. And this is a very risky period because we now know that withdrawal can cause some people to commit suicide. And because these people were on nothing, industry, including Lilly, decided that, well, we can add the numerator to the placebo group here, but not the denominator. Over on the left, you see that after the active treatment phase is over and those in active treatment, you might have some people who withdraw from active treatment and become suicidal and kill themselves. And Lilly and other companies said, well, you know, they're not on any treatment, so we can move them over to the placebo arm. And in the placebo arm, when the trial was over and people go on an SSRI afterwards and commit suicide, well, on an intention to treat basis, we can put them in the placebo arm also. All of these things have been done by companies trying to hide the problems. But even doing all of these things is still an excess of suicidal events on active treatment. And if you remember the Beasley paper that I showed you where I said there was an excess of suicidal events on Prozac in that paper, Lilly did this as well. And when you undo it, you find there was a statistically significant excess of suicidal events on Prozac compared to placebo. Here's a GlaxoSmithKline document, which caused problems for the company, as you'll see. This was around 2004, 2005, when there was a great deal of fuss about antidepressants causing people, children in particular, to be suicidal. And these data, which I put in bold at the bottom, look very bad for the company. It looks like their drug is causing serious problems. But randomized controlled trials come to the rescue. And let me show you how. There's people with major depressive disorder, and there's also people with intermittent brief depressive disorder. These are unhappy people who are miserable and go on to commit suicidal acts quite frequently. And you see, there's 2 trials here, and you see the results of those 2 trials on the bottom line there. There have previously been trials of other SSRIs in this group of patients, and the patients did very badly. But GSK were quite keen to repeat 2 more trials in this group of patients, and you'll see why now. We can even add 10 more suicidal acts to the bottom line there. So there's 46 versus 35 in the intermittent brief depressive disorder group, and still get the same magical result, which is when you add lines 3 to line 2, we get paroxetine saving lives. This is what's called Simpsons Paradox. And it arises because in almost all illness groups in medicine, whether depression or back pain or diabetes or breast cancer or Parkinson's disease, these are all multiple disorders. They're not one condition. There may be 20, 30, 40 different disorders. And when you've got that kind of situation, you will always have a risk that certain apparently depressive or diabetic disorders will hide a problem that a drug is causing in other diabetic disorders. You can use a problem a drug causes to hide a problem a drug causes. And this brings home the point that if you don't know what you're doing, randomized controlled trials are not going to answer. They're not going to clarify what the basic issues are. Over on the right, you see GSK have used odds ratios here. But whether you use statistical significance or odds ratios, these things do not apply in treatment trials, because this is not measurement error. This is heterogeneity of the underlying conditions, which cannot be solved with statistics as such. You have to know what you're doing in order to get the statistics to work, and we don't. So let me switch gears to this. In 1999, I was asked to give a talk in London and to prepare a paper. All the people giving talks in this symposium were going to prepare papers on the issues in the symposium. And I agreed and began writing the paper. And a short while later, I get an email which says, and your paper is attached. Intrigued, I downloaded the paper and read what was a really good Healy paper. It said the things that David Healy says in the way that he says them, and it had Healy references. But I had the article that I had planned to write finished at the time, so I sent it back to the company saying, look, when I agreed to get involved, I was already thinking about an article, and here it is. And they wrote back to me and said, well, this is a really good article. We like it. We'll keep it. But there were some important commercial messages in the other article. So we'll get Siegfried Casper, who was another person at the meeting, to be the author of that one. And here is exactly the same article that was given to me with only one change, the name Siegfried Casper, who is the professor of psychiatry in Vienna. It's still a great Healy article, making Healy points with Healy references and some important commercial message in there. So a year later, I'm in Pfizer's archive in New York, looking at issues about people becoming suicidal on Zoloft, and everything in there is stamped confidential. Even the Lou paper is the usual joke I have. But this document, as it turned out, wasn't. And this is a document portfolio of articles that are being ghostwritten for Pfizer on their antidepressant Zoloft. Articles on trials done in people who are depressed, and people who are anxious, people who are old, people who are young, people who have ingrown toenails, people who have hemorrhoids, and people who've got post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, Pfizer had done 4 trials of Zoloft in this particular clinical problem, and they're essentially all negative. But 2 of the trials have been taken out and were going to be written up as positive and sent to the very best journals in the field, where they are ultimately published. And on the left, you see author TBD, to be determined. And it's going to be determined by Pfizer's marketing department. They're going to pick people from Harvard or Yale or whatever who will be the kind of people who, linked to their trial and their drug, are going to help drive sales. And here's possibly the most famous ghostwritten article of the lot. And this is Study 329, which is a trial of paroxetine versus placebo in adolescents who are depressed. It appears in the journal with the highest impact factor in child psychiatry. It has an authorship line to die for, except none of these 22 people are the authors of the paper. The author is not there. She's the ghostwriter. Now, internally in GSK, a few years before that, this document, which you see a little bit of here, had recognized that this trial was a negative trial. Our drug didn't work, but we can't tell the world this. So what are we going to do? We're going to pick out the good bits of the data from Study 329, and we're going to publish those. And that's what you're seeing in the last paper. When this document fell into the hands of New York State, they took a fraud action against GSK. It also formed the basis of an action the Department of Justice took against GSK 6 years later, which resulted in GSK paying a $3 billion fine. It also resulted in a group of us getting access to the data from this trial and attempting to restore it. Now, if you want to know the full story about what happened and see the differences between the original paper and ours, you can go to study329.org, or you can read a book called Children of the Cure, which gives you more detail on who is sleeping with who that helped break this story. So we knew early on that the drug probably didn't work. And when we got hold of the raw data and analyzed it whatever way you wanted to analyze it, you could see that it didn't work. There was another 6 months worth of data that the company never published, which we went on and published. But the really interesting part of this project lay in the harms. And let me just point you to point number 2 there, failure to transcribe all adverse events. The original paper was a 10-page paper. FDA, when they got to review this study, were faced with an 800-page document and appendices, a further 5,000 pages worth of appendices. We got to see all of that plus another bunch of material, which was 77,000 pages, which, FDA don't ever see, no one ever sees. You probably will never meet anyone, even who works in the pharmaceutical industry, who has seen all of this material. What we found was a failure to move events from the 77,000 pages to the 5,000 pages, and a failure then for events to move from the 5,000 pages to the 800 pages. And of course, they didn't end up in the 10-page published document either. Let me take you to the second point from the bottom, masking effects of concomitant drugs. Well, it's almost always possible to ensure that people taking placebo in a trial are getting something very similar to the active treatment. In this case, you could let the children take an antihistamine if they needed it. And a lot of antihistamines are SSRIs, which lead to some of the children in these trials having similar effects to the SSRI that they were also taking, Paxil. So on the bottom there, you see a number of blue dots, 5 blue dots in the Keller ghostwritten paper. And these were children who are emotionally labile, who when you went and looked at the data, you found that they had become suicidal. But emotionally labile was a coding term that was used that concealed behavioral problems like children trying to kill themselves. When a fuss blew up about the SSRIs causing children to be suicidal around 2004, FDA asked GSK to go back and analyze their data again and tell them how it looked. And GSK said, oh, we now find there were 9 children who'd become suicidal in study 329. When we got access to the data, there were 14 children who'd become suicidal, and there were 4 more that we missed that I'm going to tell you about now in a moment. When you add all of those up, essentially 1 in 5 of the children in this trial taking Paxil became suicidal, which is, this is a pretty frequent problem. It's not rare. The other issue with coding was this. If you got some children becoming emotionally labile and more of them on Paxil than on placebo, you can hide the problem by adding all these things into a bigger coding group like the nervous system problems, into which you add headache and dizziness, which drown out the behavioral signal that you might be concerned about. We sent our paper when it was written up to the BMJ, who usually say it takes 8 weeks from the time we get a paper from you to the time it's published. A year later, we still hadn't been published. We have been reviewed 7 times by 7 reviewers each time. The main problem we had, though, was with the editor of the BMJ. Every time we tried to break open the nervous system group and put the behavioral problems on their own, separate from headaches and dizziness, she got very twitched and objected. And in the end, we Googled her, and we found out that she was a headacheologist working in Boston who had advocated for GSK's drugs in the past. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was not her. The problem was her husband. At least the perception was. He worked for Ropes and Gray, which were a law firm, the law firm who had been defending GSK in the action that cost them $3 billion. When we pointed this out, there was a gunfight and we won, and the article was published. But in summary, what we've got is when these trials of SSRIs for children who were depressed were run, the companies had to scour the world to find children who were depressed. Children just weren't depressed. They were unhappy or whatever, but they weren't ill. Now, of course, loads of children are ill. Antidepressants are the second most commonly taken drugs by teenage girls. There's been a total change in the culture, the way we view things. We see illnesses in a way we didn't see them before. Overall, there's 45 trials of these drugs in children and teenagers, all negative. So if we were following what we call the hard science, this wouldn't be happening. We'd have stopped using these drugs. But of course, the 30 trials done since the 1990s are all essentially ghostwritten, and they all say that the drugs work quite well. And this is playing a part. The lack of access to data and the ghostwriting of the trials is playing a part in changing the culture that we have. This isn't just an issue for medicine. It holds for people who are depressed and antidepressants. It holds across the board for all treatments that you have. Let me introduce you to another trial, one of Pfizer's trials, where a man, not in the 10-page article, but in the 800-page document, you can see that this man has died from his burns. And you can also find, because there's a one-page narrative about what happened, that agitated on Pfizer's drug, he went out and poured petrol on himself and set fire to it, intending to kill himself, but that he didn't die there and then. He died 5 days later from his burns, and so gets coded as death by burns. When you read this narrative, you realize that he should have been coded as suicide, but it wasn't. In the mid-1990s, the companies find a way to make sure you don't get to read this one page, which might give you some clue as to what actually happened. This is a picture of Kyle Rittenhouse, and I'm not trying to suggest he was taking SSRIs. It's just if you Google teenage boys on the street with guns threatening to kill people, this is the picture you get. And in study 329, there was a 15-year-old boy out in the street waving a gun around, threatening to kill people 2 weeks after he goes on Paxil. The police take him to the hospital, and this should have led to a 1 or 2 page narrative to tell you and me exactly what happened here. But it didn't. There was no narrative. There's no way of finding out what actually happened other than by accident, which is how I found this out. And what the company were able to do, or what they did, and what all companies do these days for all drug trials and vaccine trials is, let's say, for instance, you're taking a painkiller like Vioxx in a clinical trial, and a short while afterwards, you get a heart attack and die. The company in the Vioxx trials will say, well, you had an intercurrent illness, that you had a heart disease to begin with, so you shouldn't have been let into this trial. So this has nothing to do with our drug. As it turns out, however, when people get access to the data, they find that actually people taking Vioxx end up with heart attacks much more commonly than people taking other painkillers do. But using this intercurrent illness label are related labels. Companies are able to discount things as being caused by the drug, saying, look, the person obviously had an underlying condition, nothing to do with our drug. In study 329, there were 4 children who dropped out with intercurrent illness, all of them taking Paxil, none taking placebo. Let me show you this. Most people know that Prozac has been approved for teenagers who are depressed. I've said to you that all the trials were negative. That includes the trials that led to Prozac being approved. This is part of the approvable letter that GSK sent GlaxoSmithKline saying, we're happy to approve your drug for children who are depressed. We agree with you when you wrote into us and told us that study 329 and the other trials you did in teenagers who are depressed were negative trials. We agree with that. And we also agree with you that it wouldn't be helpful to mention this in the label of the drug. This is an extraordinary situation. Well, I'm not going to speculate on why would FDA do this, but I'm going to tell you FDA do this fairly routinely. Let me show you this. These are the published clinical trials on the same group of antidepressants that you all know given to adults. And these trials look very good. You know, this looks like a group of drugs that works pretty well, the occasional negative trial, but the drugs work well and are safe according to these publications. But if you look at the data within FDA, what FDA have, the data looks like this, which is that a number of the previously positive trials you saw there were in fact trials that either FDA or the company had said were negative trials, but are now published as positive. And there's a lot more negative trials that don't get published at all. And when you look at the data like this, you realize, well, you know, it's not immediately clear that we should all be taking antidepressants all that quickly. It's not clear how well they work. And it looks like they may not be all that safe either. If they don't work, they're almost by definition not safe. So let me take you back to the art and the science of medicine. We've got Healy on one side doing a nice bedside manner interview and things like that. This is the art of medicine. If I don't listen to the patient who comes in and tells me that she can't make love on this antidepressant or has become suicidal, if I don't listen, she becomes invisible. If I do listen, then this, I would say, what I've been saying the whole way through is this is the hard science. This is hard work, these interviews, and coming to a view, which is a bit scary, the view as well, as you'll see. What we're up against, though, if both the patient and I come to the conclusion the drug has caused the problem, is the so-called hard science. The evidence says, no, these drugs don't work. And the next job we have is to go and look at the evidence more closely. And when you do that, you find there's no access to the clinical trial data. The published literature is ghost-written. Not even FDA have access to the data. FDA are willing to approve drugs on the basis of negative trials. FDA happily tolerate negative trials published as positive trials. So the supposed scientific evidence, the hard science, becomes something else. This is a cartoon from 50 years ago when this Dutch cartoonist was very good at picking out the way the world was going. And what he's saying here is we're moving into a world where your judgment is being replaced by algorithms. This is an old style calculator. It's not a smartphone. Okay, but what we're talking about here is science is something that happens when you and I make judgment calls about what's going on. The data doesn't just speak for itself. We have to interpret it. We have to make a judgment call. On the other hand, you've got these controlled trials, which have lots of quantification linked to it. They look like science, but this is the artifact of medicine. It's not the science of medicine. Now, how do we solve this problem? Well, Donald Trump helped me, as you'll see. What we're talking about is techniques. Guns and drugs are techniques. And when anyone has a technique that works, there's always pressure to improve on it. So we get an arms race. And one of the things we learn from an arms race is that actually efficacy has limits. We can end up being so effective that we can't use the technique. But there's also this issue about, in the case of drugs, unlike guns, one of the other techniques we have are randomized controlled trials. And this technique, when it gets optimized, means that the drug that wins the race may be the least effective drug around the place. Winning the race is all about having the best propaganda techniques, not about having the best drugs, when in fact, we need drugs. Techniques can enhance or diminish us. When there was a school shooting in the United States some years ago, Donald Trump said, look, what we need is a good guy with a gun outside these schools. And lots of people were horrified. And he said, well, if a good guy with a gun outside a school isn't a good idea, why do we have good guys with guns outside the White House? And the point is, guns can be helpful. They can help us live the lives that we want to live. We also sense that if we let them multiply up too much and leak into places they shouldn't be, that they're going to start causing problems. And it's very much the same kind of thing with drugs. Life expectancy in the United States had been falling for 5 years before COVID. Back in the 1980s, very few of us were on more than one drug, and even then only for a short course. Now, heading towards half of us who are over the age of 45 are on 3 or more drugs, and heading towards half of us who are over 65 are on 5 or more drugs, with many people on 10 drugs or more. We know that when you're on more than 3 drugs, the drugs you're on are not going to be as effective. We've got more efficacy than we can use. You've got to get back to something like 3 drugs to get the maximum bang for your buck from the drugs you're on. So if you're on 5 or 10 drugs, deprescribing, which we know will increase your life expectancy, will reduce the rate at which you go into hospital, and will improve your quality of life becomes a key issue. But to deprescribe needs judgment calls on behalf of you and your doctor. And if you're going to live the life that you want to live, it's very important that your judgment call as to which drugs to drop and which ones to keep is being listened to. Lots of people think deprescribing is a good idea, that reducing medication burdens is a good idea, but no one, I mean, it's a smart idea, but no one's actually doing it. So is there any other way to solve the problem? Well, there's a way that involves a lot of courage. And that's, as you see here, the cartoon shows that judgment is the issue, that the pharmaceutical companies don't want you or your doctor to exercise judgment. Up till 1990, your doctor and ourselves were aware that drugs are poisons, out of which we're hoping to bring good, and we're only likely to do that if we remember we're giving, in his case, and taking, in our case, a poison. Now they've become sacraments, and anyone who talks about the possible harms they could cause is a blasphemer. They're dealing in misinformation. But the harms that a drug causes are the cracks that let the scientific light in. Let me tell you, I had a patient once who dropped out of school early, had no background in healthcare, who had a personal crisis that led to her going on an SSRI, which she found wonderfully helpful. She ends up, however, half a year later, drinking much more than she was. She crashes her car. She does a few stupid things that lead to her being picked up by the police and spending a night in jail. She loses her job. So she goes to her doctor and says, look, I think this drug you put me on, which it was great, but I think it's causing me to drink too much. And he said, no, you're just an alcoholic. And that kind of thinking just proves you're an alcoholic. I'll change your drug for you. And she knew so little about these drugs, she didn't realize that he'd essentially changed it from one SSRI to another SSRI to the same drug. So the problem kept going, and she ended up going to AA and said, look, I think my drugs are causing the problem. And again, they said to her, of course, this just proves you're an alcoholic. So she began to go on the internet and Googled the serotonin system and these drugs and worked out, and months later, maybe a year or two later, came to me. I have, as you remember, a PhD in the serotonin system, and she taught me things about the serotonin system that I didn't know. She showed me how her SSRI was causing the problem and exactly what drug might make a difference, and it did make a difference. And she was able to show me that the other people who knew about this problem were the pharmaceutical industry, who agreed with her and were doing trials to show that drugs which are like mirtazapine and actin 5-HT3 receptors can be the answer for people who have problems like her on SSRIs. So what I learned from this is that motivation is worth more than expertise. This lady who had a problem that I didn't understand was out in my waiting room, and people with her problems like this that are not in the evidence base, lots of doctors look at them and see heart sink patients is what we call them. Let me come back to that now in a moment. But part of the problem is if we're going to move this forward, let's say it's Yulia who had the problem with drinking on an SSRI. If I report Yulia's problem to CDC or FDA or any other regulator, the first thing they do is to remove her name and my name and convert the report into hearsay, convert it into misinformation. If anyone else is having a problem on an SSRI, anyone else listening is having a problem on an SSRI and knows that there's someone else with a problem on an SSRI, they can't bring that person whose name has been removed from the report, they can't bring Yulia into court. It's only if there's a case report with names on it that people like me and Yulia can be brought into court and examined, and the jury can work out, well, this person who claims that the SSRI they've been put on has caused a problem for them. Here's someone else that we can examine and ask questions, and is what they're saying consistent with the patient who's taking the legal action? And that would be powerful evidence in court. But as I say, the regulator creates misinformation. And doctors don't object to this, because everybody in the world wants drugs to work. Joe Biden wants them to work. The AMA and APA and AXA or whatever, they all want drugs to work as well. The pharmaceutical companies obviously want drugs to work. Doctors want drugs to work because we give them to people and we don't want to harm people. The patient's family wants drugs to work. Greta Thunberg's generation in particular want these drugs to work because they're taking more of these drugs than any comparable generation previously in human history. This generation who is worried about the chemicals in the environment is pumping more chemicals into themselves than anyone else ever did at that age. So if you're a doctor who speaks up about, I think these drugs could cause harms on some occasions, you're going to have a Tiananmen Square moment. And most doctors don't want a moment like that. So that's the courage end of things, which is important and we need. There's another element, which I'm going to introduce you to, and this is the strangest element of all. This is the lady in my waiting room, and she doesn't look very pretty, and she doesn't smell very pretty. And she's going to come in and tell me that SSRIs have caused a problem for her making love. And she's going to ask me, what can I do about it? Now, I'm taking this from an Arthurian legend called Gawain and the Loathly Lady. King Arthur is out one day in the forest and meets a black knight who challenges him to a joust. And the black knight wins and ends up with his sword at Arthur's throat and says, I'm not going to kill you now. I'm going to challenge you to solve a riddle for me. The riddle is, what do women most desire? You have a year to find the answer. You must come back here in a year's time. And if you can't answer the riddle, I'm going to kill you. So of course, Arthur goes back to the court and gets everybody in the court to start asking all the women they know, what do women most desire? And there's no consistent answer across the board. And almost a year is up and Arthur's out with his knights for a ride in the forest. And they see this lady who says, I have the answer to the question of what do women most desire. But for you to get the answer, you've got to give me one of your knights in marriage. Gawain jumps down and says, Your Majesty, I will marry this lady. Everybody's shocked at this, but they all go back to the court, and the next day the wedding takes place, and you can see everybody here in the picture is looking fairly horrified because what's Gawain going to do when they go up to the bedchamber? This is a marriage. The woman is insisting on being married. So Gawain, when they go up to the bedchamber, Gawain can't look at her. He's kind of caught now. He only looks at her when she touches him on the shoulder. And when she does, and he turns around, he sees the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. But she gives him a problem. She says, which do you want? Do you want me to look like this when we're here in the bedchamber at night, but look the way I was looking during the day when we're in the court? Or do you want me to look like this in the court during the day and look the way I was looking at the wedding in the bedchamber at night? Which is not an easy question to answer. And Gawain ultimately says, whatever you want, which is the correct answer, as it turns out. And she's able to be, as you see her now, both by day and by night. Now, why am I telling you this story? Well, I said there was 100 heart-sink patients out in the waiting room. That's how most doctors see them. The other way to see them is 100 free research assistants, people whose motivation is worth a lot more than my expertise. I can have an input, I can help guide them, but these are people who can solve problems that I'm not going to solve, at least not on my own. One of the curious things is that the more you work with people like this, the more you collaborate with them, the more you like them and they like you, which makes it easier for you to like them and them to like you, etc. This points to something important, which is there's an intimate bond between science and democracy and love. Science does not exist where there's, at least not proper science, where there's absolute power. Science doesn't exist either if someone thinks they've got absolute truth. And science won't exist either where someone else has control of pretty well all the money. It's a collaborative exercise, or it's real science is a collaborative exercise, or it's nothing at all. So if you want to hear more about these ideas, the key book, where they came from and the history of what we've been through, the key book is Shipwreck of the Singular, which you see here. You can find out more on my blog, davidhealy.org, on the risk.org blog, which is an adverse event reporting website. You can find out all about PSSD and conditions like this. After you've got hold of the book, and after you get hold of all the slides, which I'm going to email you along with the text, if you have any questions you want to ask me, please do. You can get hold of me on david.healy@risk.org. And you can look at the books like this one and others on samizdahealth.org. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I look forward to getting your questions, which in this instance are probably going to have to be by email. Thank you.